welcome to Mornings on Main. We are very excited for you guys to be here. We have a good, solid number here to see Dr. Hoffman talk about historic preservation. So we're really, really excited for that. It's a beautiful Missouri morning here. Let's go through a couple logistics. So all attendees are coming in the listen only mode. So you're automatically muted and not able to share your screen. But we do encourage you to type any questions you may have into that chat function, and we'll get to those at the end. You can toggle your audio functionality between your phone and your computer. If you have issues with your internet or the audio isn't working with your computer, you can go ahead and listen on your phone. And if we're not able to address any of your questions, we should have some time at the end. But if for some reason we're not able to get to your question, you can go ahead and send me an email at ben@momainstreet.org, and we will make sure to get that answered for you. Without further ado, Gayla, would you like to introduce our speaker for today?
I would love to. So many of you all know Dr. Stephen Hoffman. And as you know, famously, as Dr. Stephen Hoffman always says, he is been our past president for Missouri Main, or he has been our president for Missouri Main Street Connection here. He's also been part of the board of directors at Old Town Cape. And of course, he's still on the Missouri Main Street board. Of course, he's still very active in downtown Cape, as you can tell by the banners behind him. But as Dr. Stephen Hoffman always says, my daytime job, though, is he is the preservation program coordinator. I'm going to get it right here in a minute. Historic preservation program coordinator at Southeast Missouri State University. And so we're just very happy to have Stephen with us this morning. He's been such an integral part of Missouri Main Street since its very early years beginning. Always keep us very grounded in that historic preservation is economic development. It is what our downtowns are about. It's what sets us apart from every other kind of program out there and makes our communities continue to thrive. And so we thought it was really important to wrap this all together by, we're always talking about it. Stephen keeps us very grounded in this, and we much appreciate that, but we're going to turn it over to Dr. Stephen Hoffman to tell us why that is so important. Stephen.
Great, thank you, Gayla, and thank you, Ben. Let me share my screen here. Ben, I think you need to let me do that. Oh, there we go.
There you go.
Okay. So is that sharing okay?
Yes.
Now, okay, great. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate your getting up this morning and joining us. And I appreciate Gayla and Ben for inviting me to talk about the value of historic preservation in your community. And so let's see if I can get this to work. You know, we got up early and we came on to make sure all our stuff was working, and there we go. Now, for whatever reason, I couldn't get that to work right. So anyway, well, the perspective here that I'd like to offer is really to kind of talk about, you know, well, what is the value of historic preservation, and really it kind of depends on who you are and what your perspective is. And in terms of trying to communicate the value in your community, it really is perhaps more importantly who your audience is, because historic preservation, I think, encompasses a wide variety of values that will resonate differently with different people. And today, what I want to do is I kind of want to focus on sort of three perspectives on the value of historic preservation. And first, kind of looking at the social, cultural, aesthetic values which I think is the perspective that many of us who get involved in historic preservation, that this is the route that we take. This is the one that we kind of find the most connection to. Certainly the students that I teach in historic preservation at the university, this is the reasoning that they tend to have. Again, different people have different perspectives. And so really also, I think it's important to talk about the economic value. And in some way, these arguments can be the most powerful, particularly for people who, who are not necessarily engaged by that social, cultural, aesthetic perspective. And then I want to kind of close out our time this morning with some sort of practical perspectives on preservation and some things that we need to be thinking about, and thinking about the ways in which historic preservation can play a role in them. And here I'm talking about sustainability, equity and inclusion, and this concept that we call place attachment. And so in terms of social, cultural, aesthetic values, this really has a lot to do with community, identity, and memory. Historic buildings are tangible connection to the past. On the slide here, I have a building that is fairly iconic in my community, which is Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and it's the Court of Common Pleas, and it was built in the 1850s, added on in the 1880s, which kind of gives it its current look with the tower and the wings. And this building really, in a lot of ways, represents Cape Girardeau. As I say, it's an iconic building. It's visible from the riverfront. It appears in things like postcards, and it has appeared in postcards for for over 100 years. So when you preserve buildings like this, you're preserving that tangible connection to the past. That this is where we have our community identity and memory. Oftentimes buildings can also resonate with people individually, and so they become kind of the stage setting for our lives and who we are, and they kind of represent the memory of how we became who we are. And so if you have those buildings, you have these touchstones to the past. And so preservation is really important to kind of maintain that sense of continuity, that sense of like knowing who we are, and really in a lot of ways it's just like people, that when we lose our memories, in some ways we lose ourselves, and so our communities are the same way. So this kind of representation of who we are and who we've been and the journey that we've taken as a community and as a society are really represented in the buildings that we preserve, in the landscape and the stories that we tell about them. There's also an aesthetic component to historic buildings, and Stuart Brand, who's the author of How Buildings Learn, asked the question of like, what makes a building come to be loved? Because some buildings achieve that status, and the courthouse here is one of them. It had been slated for demolition and replacement with a federal courthouse, and and this was in the 1950s. And basically the people kind of rose up and instituted a lawsuit, and they rallied around the preservation of this building, that they had come to love this building as a symbol of more than just a place of business, but as something greater, part of their community identity. And so Stuart Brand, in asking that question, discovered that really it was age. That buildings that survived more than a couple of generations took on a particular kind of character that really, you know, caused people to love them. And his quote is that any building over than 100 years will be considered beautiful no matter what, that age brings its own quality of beauty. And so if you want to have beauty in your lives, if you want to have this connection to the past and to your ancestors, then historic preservation is a way of achieving that. And the value of historic preservation is that it gives you those things. Now, this perspective, I think, is pretty well discussed in Tom Mays's book, Why Old Places Matter. And kind of, if you look at that, you know, I don't know what to call it, not really a diagram, but all of these dots and these aspects of memory and beauty and individual identity and history and community and collective identity and connection to the ancestors, that all of kind of these dimensions are really important, and they're really significant. And I think if you want to learn more about it, kind of have a nice presentation of that perspective, I think you can't do any better than Tom Mays's book. He's the Deputy General Counsel for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So he spent his career working in this field, and I think he expresses those values very, very well. It can be poetic in some ways. And quite honestly, I recognize that it can get kind of touchy-feely. And so that is not necessarily the way that everybody views the built landscape. There certainly are people who see buildings as real estate, and who see real estate as an investment. And if you're looking at the world through those lens, then this perspective is probably not going to resonate particularly well with you. And so I think that the economic arguments in some ways become the most powerful because they're not particularly touchy-feely. And yet I think they can be very persuasive. And we're at a point in time where we have lots of really good evidence for the economic value of historic preservation. And I think nobody speaks better to this than Donovan Ripkema. And I promised Ben and Keith, who's not here with us this morning, but I promised I wouldn't just channel Donovan Ripkema this morning. But in some ways, it's hard not to, given the work that he's done over the last 30 years, looking at the economics of historic preservation. And so I would, if you have not yet had a chance to hear him speak, I would definitely add that to your bucket list of things to do. And his firm, Place Economics, has just a wealth of data to go to for support for this idea of the economics of historic preservation. And when he talks about kind of the big four, right? That he's been doing presentations now and studies rather for 30 years, 30 plus years. And so his arguments, he's kind of developed into this sort of the big four. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on all of these. He's very clear about downtown revitalization and that Main Street is the most cost-effective economic development program. And when Don presents this, it's not just an opinion. He has, studies from just state after state after state, kind of really looking at the numbers that that kind of justify this statement. And so you can go to his website, and he's got over 60 studies that are available there for download, and you can kind of see how this plays out in a variety of different states. And so preservation is at the if it's not at the core of what Main Street does, it's certainly what makes it distinctive from other economic redevelopment programs. The jobs and income argument is a really interesting one, and again, I'm going to kind of, I'm not going to quote a lot of statistics for you because that's really what Ripkema does, and I'll just send you to his site. But he presents some really nice information about kind of comparative statistics on where you spend your money as a society, and what the return on that investment is. And so if you spend $1 million on manufacturing, or if you spend $1 million on new construction, what will you get in terms of the number of jobs? What will you get in terms of the overall household income? And he takes those numbers and he compares them with what you get with rehab, and rehab wins hands down every time. And why is that? Well, some people will say, well, it's more expensive to do historic preservation, to do historic rehab than it is to do new construction. And in some cases, that's true, which is why we have the tax incentives to help subsidize that a little bit. But partly it's the nature of the project that's being done. New construction tends to have a higher percentage of the budget associated with materials and less of the budget to labor. Historic rehab is just the opposite, that it's more labor intensive. So more of the budget goes into paying laborers because you're recycling the materials that are already there. Well, those labor dollars stay in the community and recycle in the community. And so there's really a much more significant economic impact from rehabbing historic buildings than from new construction. And so it really, I think, is a pretty powerful argument in support of policy directives like tax credits or kind of an overall perspective. The last two, heritage tourism and property values, are really, I think, in some ways the ones that I want to spend just a little more time with, in that I think that it can make sense to a broader spectrum of people in the community. And again, I would urge you to go to Place Economics and kind of look at these studies, because Donovan really dives deeply into these in sort of the specific context. I'm going to talk just a little more generally. The bottom line is that heritage tourists stay longer and spend more money, and they're more likely to stay overnight. And if you know anything about the tourism and travel business, you know, like that's golden. Everybody has a sense that if our community could have a major league sports team, or a minor league sports team, or you know, some sort of recreational facility where teams come and do competitions, right? This kind of sports tourism is really very popular. People talk about it as a economic driver, but study after study after study shows that heritage tourists are really much more important for local economies because they are staying longer and they're spending more money. And the interesting fact is that it's the historic heritage resources that draw people to the community, but that's not necessarily where they spend their money. One of Ripkema's studies shows that the heritage sites, and I want to say this is from Texas, but that people spend about 7% of their total expenditures at the historic site, which means that the other 93% are being spent out in the community at restaurants and hotels and you know, fast food and convenience stores and those kinds of things. So so if you can create an environment that has rich heritage resources, then that can be a driver of heritage tourism, which really can have a major effect on historic preservation. So when you, I mean, on the community. So when you talk to your tourism people, make sure they understand the value of historic preservation for the overall economy. And then the property values question is one that I think really affects more individual property owners rather than sort of the community as a whole. You know, when I first started in this business, there were a couple of studies that suggested that if properties were listed on the National Register, or better yet, they were subject to local landmark designation, that didn't, not only did it not decrease the value of their property because of some perception of additional bureaucratic controls over them, but it actually increased the value of their property. And when I would talk about that, people would say, well, yeah, but that's Texas and we're not Texas, or that's New York, or that's Charleston. Of course, you know, things are different here. But like now we're, you know, over 30 years into this, and there are just, you know, study after study after study that show pretty conclusively that in almost every case, if a property is in a historic district, that its property values will increase at a rate higher than the city as a whole, and that's even more true for a local district that has design review standards. There was a study in Philadelphia that looked at values over a 30-year period, and those in a National Register district increased 14% more than the city as a whole, and in a local district, 22% more than the city as a whole. I think that's pretty powerful. Again, in an opposite way from sort of the touchy-feely cultural historic preservation is an important way to connect to our past argument, but just in a very practical, you know, you're buying real estate as an investment, you're going to get more out of that investment if you either do it in a historic district, or if you move to make your area listed as a historic district. So these are sort of the big four areas that Ripkema talks about in terms of sort of economic value of historic preservation. If you listen to him, and again, I urge you to, if you haven't yet, he's well worth the time. You should definitely add it to your bucket list. He kind of goes on. He sort of talks about sort of the new 10. So we got the big 4, and then the new 10. And I'm not really going to go into this much at all. You know, he talks about how, you know, he's looked at, you know, foreclosures, and there are fewer of them in historic districts, and that, you know, even when the entire market is crashing, you know, all houses, that there's more stability in historic districts than for cities as a whole, and sort of the value of density and walkability, and historic districts being the location of sort of creative industries, and you know, the place of first return. I really just want to focus on a couple of these, but these are kind of, you know, where he goes, and the information that he is able to bring to bear, that really shows the economic value of historic preservation. And so I share that with you, and urge you to kind of check that out a little more fully. Like I said, I want to just focus on a couple of these, and one really has to do with sort of the knowledge and creative industries, and you know, these are the you know, kind of the new, you know, startups. Richard Florida wrote a book a number of years ago talking about the creative class, and sort of the character of those communities that attracted the creative class, and what we find is that they really end up being attracted to historic districts. So communities that have done a better job of preserving their historic environments are doing a better job of attracting this kind of talent. The slide that I'm sharing now comes from the Atlas of Reurbanism, which the National Trust has put out. And what they've done is they've kind of looked at, I want to say it's like 50 cities, and they've created these character scores, which is kind of based on the age of the buildings, and the diversity of age of the buildings, and the size of the buildings and parcels, and they've kind of, you know, rated then every, you know, block in the city, and they kind of give these character scores. And what they found is that in the high character score areas, which are essentially our historic districts, with their mix of older buildings and smaller buildings, is that this is where small businesses are locating. Almost 60% of small businesses in these cities are located in historic districts. They represent 33% more new business jobs, and 46%, almost half, of all small business jobs are located in these historic districts. Again, they're not just looking at listed districts. They're just kind of looking at, you know, older districts that we could classify as historic districts. And you ask, well, why is this? Why would, you know, businesses locate in these places? And to kind of help answer that, I'm going to share a quote it's actually kind of a long quote from Jane Jacobs, who is the author of The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And this was published in 1961, so it's not a new idea. And she writes and says, cities need old buildings so badly, it is probably impossible for vigorous streets and districts to grow without them. If a city has only new buildings, the enterprises that can exist there are automatically limited to those that can support the high costs new construction. As for really new ideas of any kind, no matter how ultimately profitable or otherwise successful some of them might prove to be, there is no leeway for such chancy trial, error, and experimentation in the high overhead economy of new construction. Old ideas can sometimes use new buildings. New ideas must use old buildings. And she wrote that in 1961, and I think that it was true then, and it's true today, that new construction has higher costs, occupancy costs associated with it than historic buildings. And so the variety of sizes and rent levels that exist in historic commercial districts are just more amenable to the development of new business ventures. In a lot of ways, our historic districts are in and of themselves business incubators. They provide the low entry cost for new business, for entrepreneurs just starting out. The Atlas for New Urbanism had a line in there, a sentence that I thought worth quoting and sharing, that every Starbucks, Boeing, or Microsoft, which I'm sure you recognize those names, those are pretty big companies, they had to start somewhere. And in each of these cases, older, smaller buildings provided the launching ground. And so as we think about the entrepreneurial landscape, and we think about wanting to attract the businesses of the future, particularly sort of the technology companies that we don't know what they're going to do yet, kind of this, wherever the future is going, people are working on it now. And if we're going to attract them to our community, we need to make sure that we have the kinds of districts that will attract and retain them. And those are clearly and without question are historic districts for a variety of reasons, partly because of the character that they represent, but partly just the economics of being kind of incubator spaces for these new ideas. So that's, I think, one of Donovan's sort of next 10 that I think really resonates well for us as historic preservationists interested in downtown revitalization. Another aspect that I want to kind of talk a little bit about is this idea of sustainability and the environment. And the quote from Carl Elephant of "the greenest building is the one that's already built." And again, I don't know what your thoughts are about global climate change, but clearly there are things going on, and clearly sustainability is something that we all need to be concerned with. And so as we look at our building stock and recognize how much of an impact our buildings have on the environment, it's useful to know, if you look at this chart that comes from the National Trust, from their Green Building Lab. It's now called the Research and Policy Lab, but when they put this out, they were the Green Building Lab. You can see that the problem is not our older historic buildings, right? People say, oh, old buildings are so energy inefficient. Well, the pre-World War II buildings, that's not particularly true. Where we find sort of the biggest energy hogs are really in those post-World War II buildings. But even then, this idea that the answer is to tear them down and to replace them with a new green building is just not. Well, it's basically not true. The Green Lab did a very extensive study, and again, I would urge you to kind of to look at this, and they look at a variety of different building types and different kinds of interventions, and there's a lot of really good information there. But they came to the conclusion that it takes 10 to 80 years for a new building that's 30% more efficient than your average building to overcome the costs of new construction through energy savings. So we may have some issues, but tearing down historic buildings and building new green buildings is not the solution. This is definitely not the answer. And I think that partly not to keep channeling Donovan Ripkema, but he likes to talk about sort of the equivalency of tearing down a historic building is equal to, or not tearing down a historic building is equal to recycling over 1 million aluminum cans, right? And so that's just something people can relate to, right? We want to be good citizens, so we recycle our aluminum cans. But really, if we just concentrated on preserving the buildings that are already built, we would have a much greater impact on the environment. And so if you're an environmentalist, you should be a historic preservationist. And I think this can be a powerful argument for people who may not be into that touchy-feely, touchstone with the past stuff, and maybe they're not real estate investors and motivated for profit in the real estate market, but they're concerned about the planet. Well, they should be right alongside us in terms of historic preservation as well. There's this idea of sort of these buildings represent the embodied energy that it took to create them. And so that's something I think that makes a lot of sense. And so we don't want to throw that away if we can rehab it. And the idea is that you start layering these reasons, these different, the value that we find in it. And so, we're making an environmental investment by keeping the building that we have and by rehabbing it. And then we're investing more of that construction money into wages rather than materials. And so then those dollars are going into our community and creating kind of a higher quality of life for the residents. So sustainability, I think, is an important argument. And then there's this notion of thinking about sustainability more broadly, and that connects to this concept of walkability. And so, if you're in a walkable neighborhood, then you don't need to use your car, and you don't need to burn those fossil fuels. It has the benefits of creating kind of greater health and sustainability. This is from the Walk Score website, and so again, I would encourage you to visit this if you've not. I think they've got some really great information. You can calculate the Walk Score of your neighborhood. But people who live in more walkable neighborhoods are healthier. Studies have shown they tend to weigh less because they're out there moving, they're in their cars less. There are financial implications. Cars are the second largest household expense in the United States. And so if you live in a place where not everybody needs a car to do everything, you can certainly save money there, which means that the value of the properties are higher. They've done a study that shows 1 point in Walk Score is worth up to over $3,000 in property value. People are more engaged. And what are these walkable neighborhoods? These are our historic neighborhoods and districts. Historic districts are more sustainable, and they are better for us. So these are all good things. And then there's the whole question of equity and inclusion. And I think these are just some practical, considerations in thinking about global climate change and in thinking about health and automobile dependence. And I think we also need to think about equity and inclusion. The reality is that our population demographics are changing. What does this have to do with, this is the future, which it is. What does it have to do with the past? What does this have to do with historic preservation? Well, not only is the population becoming more diverse, but younger generations also value diversity more. And so partly what we need to do is we need to do a better job at telling the story of all America, of being inclusive in how we relate the story of our past. And of course, historic buildings and neighborhoods are really a good way to do that, right? Because this is where our past is made tangible. And so we're kind of connecting back to some of those first arguments that I made. We need to recognize this kind of changing demographic, but we also need to recognize that an increasing number of people are going to increasingly be interested in diversity, that they are going to want to live in places that are diverse, and they're going to want to work in businesses that value diversity. And where are those? If we go back to the Atlas of Reurbanism, we find out that those places are in our high character score districts, right? They're in our historic districts. That the 64% of people of color in these 50 cities that are in the Atlas live in these historic districts. It's also where we find women and minority-owned businesses, 60% more than in the city across as a whole. Supporting historic preservation and preserving these historic districts and neighborhoods really is a way of kind of maintaining and continuing to foster this sense of equity and inclusion. And if we look at the rate at which things are changing, this is something that we really need to be doing right now. So I think those are some value that historic preservation brings to the table in terms of thinking about equity and inclusion. And then the last point that I want to make is focuses on this idea of place attachment. And we talk a lot about in historic preservation and in Main Street about sense of place, and sort of the sense of place is important because it's places that have a greater sense of place are easier to form place attachment to. And the Knight Foundation did a study called The Soul of the Community, and they talked to people about what it was that they valued in terms of either moving to or staying in a city, and so basically looked at the drivers for attracting and retaining people, and they were startled to find that it wasn't jobs the economy, or safety. Which isn't to say those aren't really important. Those are kind of your base, base needs. You need a place that's safe. But you can get that lots of places. And so the really distinguishing aspects that came out of this study were in areas physical beauty, opportunities for socializing, and community openness to all people. And when they did this study, they also found sort of that there's a real value to having a high degree of place attachment in your community, that those communities had a higher GDP, that they performed better economically, that they had more engaged citizens. Peter Kageyama talks a lot about this, and he talks about sort of developing an emotional infrastructure, a way to connect people to these communities. And one of the things that we found fairly consistently is that historic environments are stickier kinds of environments, that they're easier for people to become attached to, because they provide a greater sense of place identity and place dependence. There's more things to do, more ways to connect, kind of all of these things that people are looking for as a reason to stay or move to a community are really found in our historic communities. And so in a way, it kind of comes back to that first discussion about place identity and community continuity and a connection to place that historic preservation allows and provides for, that then becomes important for place attachment, which then becomes important for both quality of life and economic success. And so in thinking about the value of historic preservation, it's really, there are lots of reasons. It kind of depends on who you are. Maybe it's community identity and memory. Maybe it's some aspect of economic value, or thinking about talent attraction and being a magnet for creative industries, and therefore wanting the historic buildings to do that. Maybe it's sustainability or equity and inclusion, or this, I want to love, I want our community to be lovable and for people to want to be here and to be able to be attached to it. And so really, what's the value of historic preservation? Well, it's both different things for different people, and it's all of these things combined. And so whatever it is you value, if you want a better future for your community, then you need to do a better job preserving your past. And of course, as we all know, Main Street can help. So that's what I have for you. So I'm looking forward to any questions that you might have.
Great job, Stephen.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
It makes us want to just take our flags out and, move them around. HP flags. I'm going to go get it out of Caitlin's office. Wow, that was really, really good. Yeah. So
we have a couple questions for you.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so this first one is, do you think that preserving any historic building, even if it's not one used to employ people, for example, like not-for-profit offices or those kinds of the ventures, benefits the community as well by making or keeping the surrounding property values up? So not necessarily, adding to the sales tax value, but that a good building will lift the property values of all those around and bring more people to the area.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question, and I think it there are a couple of different ways to look at it. One is that we know our historic buildings are are robust and resilient, and that they are able to accommodate different uses. And so it could be that today there's a not-for-profit in there, but the likelihood that someday there'll be another use in there if that building is there, I think is is high. And so, on that economic level, I wouldn't just write it off right now, because of a non-taxpaying use. But I think that the larger point of, the way that people experience historic environments is not in isolation. That a beautiful historic building surrounded by trash-strewn parking lots is not going to create the same kind of feeling
Right.
as an intact block of historic buildings. And so this historic buildings have a role to play in developing a sense of place. But they're not the only factor in that. And so it really is a larger environmental concern. So absolutely, hands down, if you can preserve and use a historic building, even for for a great not-for-profit use like a Main Street office, that you should definitely do that.
Great. No, I think that's a great
Well,
answer.
and many times, many times the office, the organization will take over that historic building because they're going to lose it.
Right.
And sometimes it's just given to them, so we don't lose that historic building. We have several of those communities that have been given historic buildings. Sometimes, that's a great thing, but sometimes if the budget isn't there, it can be a detriment to the organization as well. But we have some great examples across the state where the Main Street has been the force to preserve those buildings. And their office didn't stay there,
Right.
they
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
I say that's the important thing, is stabilizing those structures and continuing the legacy of those buildings, because like you said, it may not always be a business or not-for-profit in there, but the rehab work that goes into it is long lasting in many cases if done correctly. So
Well, in Washington, Missouri is probably one of the greatest examples is the log cabin that now a Airbnb, but it started out as the Main Street office because they wanted to preserve that old cabin, which is a remarkable project.
Yep. All right, another question. Have you seen examples of historic preservation inclusion in some rural communities and helping to tell that story?
I think that yes, there are. I think that there are lots of opportunities and kind of ways of speaking about the past. I mean, part of the, let's see, sorry, I have a bunch of ideas kind of running through my head. I think, first and foremost, it's important to be authentic about telling the stories of who we are. But when you start asking the questions about, well, who made this? Like who were the people who worked here? Who were the people that really may not get the name brand recognition for making this community, but were an essential part of it. And so, did the railroad come through town, and who were the railroad workers? Or, a place like Cape Girardeau, is a river town. Well, like it required the labor and the participation of lots of diverse kinds of people. So finding those stories and connecting them to place, I think becomes a powerful way to do that. I just finished a field school in St. Genevieve, and the Felix Valley State Historic Site is there. Of course, St. Genevieve known for its French colonial heritage and the persistence of its French culture into the American period. But we were talking about the wash house behind the Felix Valley house, and and talking about the bricks and being able to see the handprints in the bricks, and it's likely that enslaved individuals made those bricks and washed the clothes in that wash house and slept in the loft above, and so I think that there are resources in our communities that are connected to a wider range of people whose stories we could tell but have not traditionally told, and so so I think that that there are increasingly examples across the state and nation where we're doing a better job of that, and we have a lot of work to do, but I think that I think it's important work and we need to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So another question we got was, and I'm going to broaden this out a little bit too, how do we communicate the importance of historic preservation to property owners? And I'll broaden it out even to the rest of the community. How do we let people know that historic preservation is important? And I think using those different audiences, like you talked about, and those different reasonings is a great touch point. First and foremost, because everyone sees it differently. They're touchy-feely, or they're environmental, or they see the economic benefits of it, which I think is important with property owners. So I'll let you speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, I think that really in some ways it requires conversation, and it requires listening and trying to find out what individuals are interested in, and so to kind of start with the property owners. So are we talking commercial district property owners, which is probably a good guess given the nature of this forum, right? And so I think it's like, okay, you own this property. What do you want? What do you hope for? Why do you own it? What's your vision of where this can go? Well, if we had a historic district here, if you're doing it as an investment, and if we have a historic district and we could do, and we have a certified local CLG, certified local government, and we can do local landmark, designation. If we did that, then like, I know you're going to do the right thing, but this helps control other people, and this is going to increase the value of your property over the long term. Maybe that's it, that they're invested in that because they're absentee property owners or whatever, and it's just part of their portfolio. Or maybe they're residents in the community and can say, look, if we maintain the character of this historic district, we're going to attract more more shoppers. We're going to attract more visitors. There'll be more money in the community, and so maybe that's what they're interested in. Or maybe they're sad because they're worried that their grandchildren are going to move away to the big city, and it's like, well, you know what, if we invest in our historic resources and we create a dynamic place to be, we live in a world where people choose where they want to live, and then they find a job that allows them to live there. And that is true in a way that it's never been true before. So if you want to keep your kids in this community, then let's create a community that people want to live in, and historic preservation is going to be a way to do that. And then I would, again, I promise not to channel Donovan Ripkema, but he's got this great book, and I get no commission on this, but he's got this great book, The Economics of Historic Preservation, which is like a list of 100 reasons, and then at the end it's got this, like, in this circumstance, look at these arguments. But what I would do is I would say, okay, let's, Donovan Ripkema has done all this research on where people are going back to cities, but they're not just going back to cities, they're going back to historic districts. And I would use that. This is where young people are going. Let's create a space like that if you want to keep your grandchildren. If it's a residential neighborhood, it really depends on like what the person that you're talking to is interested in and what motivates them. And then, so your job is to talk to them, to find that out, and then connect them to the reason that would make the most sense for them. Because there are a multitude of reasons, as I tried to suggest, from from just the I love history to the cold economics to the saving the planet, whatever it is, historic preservation can help.
Yeah. Well, and some of that is building relationships with those building owners, those people in your community. Just figuring out, what drives them. Like you said, why they buy the building? What's their reasoning here? Is it for an investment? Is it to save the downtown? Because they see the value of that? What is the reasoning? And everyone's going to be a little bit different in that. So that's very, very important.
Exactly.
I think we have time for one more. We're kind of butting up against 9:30, but I'll do one more here. Have you seen how communities can use COVID dollars to move this effort forward?
Oh, that's a great question. And I might need to defer, more to Gayla and the team on that. I think there is incredible potential as dollars are coming into communities to stimulate economic growth. And then we have all this evidence that shows how historic preservation can be an economic driver. I think it really is just, connecting the dots. And so I'm hoping that you provide the answer to that question over the course of the next 2 years, so that when we gather around, we'll have all these examples of how that was accomplished. So what I see is possibility rather than it's too new to really point to things that would be successes.
Yeah. Stephen, what we're really encouraging is to people, our local people, to be at the table, county and city, because just like the CARES Act dollars, we had some counties that actually did Mornings on Main that showed ways that they were using the CARES Act dollars to do some facade renovation grants, direct business grants, all of those things. It's all about economic development. And our hope is that our cities and our counties invest into Main Street, historic districts, for a return on investment, where it's not all infrastructure, because that's a kind of an easy way out. We all need roads and bridges, granted, but we also need to do a return on investment. And where is the greatest investment that we could get on that return is the small businesses. And, just your presentation right here today, take it, use that information, be at the table, talk about heritage tourism, talk about that the younger people are coming back to our communities, our rural communities. They are our next entrepreneur. And all of that creates sales tax revenues. So, the biggest thing is if you don't ask, you don't have. You've got to be at the table and giving them ideas. And we're going to continue this conversation as well and give you all more pointers and ideas that you can take to the table.
Yeah. So go ahead.
I was going to say, and I think too that, some of that information that I alluded to about RIPCMA providing X number of dollars spent on highway construction or management, and that on rehab, the return on that investment is much higher. And so kind of because they already know, oh, wow, if I spend money fixing the roads, that's a really good thing to do. And then if you can say, well, look, and I'm making this number up, but look, you can get, 50% more, twice as much, number of jobs, or, rise in family income, which is going to recirculate in our community if you spent it on rehab instead of on these more traditional things that you're thinking of. I think that can be powerful.
Yeah. And we have a great example right now. We have a county that came to us and said, many of our communities here are not following the Main Street philosophy. They're not doing the 4-point approach. There's not that return on investment locally. People are moving out. We're losing population. We want to use some of these dollars to bring you all in and work with 5 communities and create a Main Street program, help them form the foundation that, you know, hopefully in years to come, there is that return on the investment. We know it's proven, we know it can work. And so that's a way that county is investing some of the dollars.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep. Really, really
Very
exciting.
exciting.
All right. I'm gonna stop your screen share so I can go.
All right, we are a little
Yes.
bit over time, but we want to talk about our next Mornings on Main, a continuation, actually, Stephen, of this conversation.
Yeah.
So that, mark your calendars, it's July 7th. It's actually, Allison is going to be talking from the Missouri State Parks. She's going to be talking about Historic Preservation Fund. So there's 2 grants that are available to us. Missouri State Parks offers 2 types of funding for outdoor recreation, and also recreational trails program and the Land and Water Conservation Fund grant. So those 2 are available to continue this historic preservation discussion and how important it is. So we look forward to having you all with us on July the 7th. And again, Stephen, this was great.
Yes. Thank you.
Really
Thank you
good.
very much. Thank you for
Really,
having
really
me, and
great.
thank you everyone for being here.
We sure appreciate you.
Yep. Thank you.
Everybody have a great week.
Yep. Have a great week. Enjoy that weather.
Bye-bye.
Bye.